Hello, and welcome to the Chalkboard, a podcast hosted by the Gogebic-Ontonagon Intermediate School District. This monthly podcast shares how the GOISD works to inspire students every day and to support the work of our local school districts. I'm Alan Topo, your host and superintendent of the Gogebic-Ontonagon ISD. Today's episode is the first in our 2024-2025 series and features our Career and Technical Education, Food Systems, and Natural Resources program. Laurie Scott, our program's instructor, is here with me today. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to be here, Laurie. I know there's a lot going on in your classroom, and I appreciate you being our first episode of this season.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here today, Alan.
Well, let's start, Laurie, with some of your background. You've been the CTE Food Systems and Natural Resources program instructor for the last 3 years. And this has been something that I know you are very passionate about. I've had the opportunity on many occasions to visit your classroom, to be in the greenhouse with your students, and to watch presentations that your students have made at our board meetings. So I know this is something you care a lot about and you get really excited about. Did you see yourself working in this kind of field as you were going through school?
You know, I actually had never in a million years thought that I'd be going into teaching. And as I was finishing up my education at UW River Falls, I was studying agricultural business with an emphasis in animal science. And I knew that I've always wanted to work in agriculture. I've been passionate about it since I was young. I grew up on a farm and worked with animals a lot, and I had an internship at a greenhouse. So I knew I wanted to work in this field. And I found that as I was trying to look for jobs closer to home in the Upper Peninsula, there was nothing really standing out to me. And this job, and at the time it was called the agriculture instructor, had shown up. And I was actually a student in CTE when I was in high school. So I really knew the benefits of career technical education when I took it in high school as a CNA student. And I started looking into the curriculum, looking into the program of how we're going to have so many opportunities for the hands-on educational experience. And it was an opportunity for me to share my passion for agriculture with the next generation of students. And as I looked more into the job, I was so much more excited about it. And I'm so happy that I was able to make that decision to pursue this job because it's been great ever since.
Well, we're glad to have you on our team.
Thank you.
When people hear the title of the class, the former title was agriculture, and it went through a program review, and you took a look at, what the program goals and objectives were and what students really should take away from it. And it was relabeled the Food Systems and Natural Resources program. What can students expect to do in a program like this?
Thanks for asking that. So in our Food Systems and Natural Resources program, when we talk about the agriculture sector in our country, we're really looking at all of those systems. So that name change really helped us broaden what we have already actually covered in the class. Mm-hmm. The really important thing about the agriculture education model is that it's 3 parts that are all equally important and are very different from each other too. So first we have the agriculture classroom instruction. So that's going to be covering our plant systems, our animal systems, our forestry, our natural resources, and all of the science and base level knowledge that we need to know about these systems to really understand them, even outside of their careers. And it's the time where we're in the classroom and learning the information we need really to segue into the next part, which is going to be the supervised agriculture experience. So that's going to be taking our knowledge and really putting it to work with our hands, with our minds. We're going to spend a lot of time out in the greenhouse actually growing and propagating plants. We're also going to have a big plant sale every year, which is a great opportunity for students to really take an all-encompassing approach to the plant systems and actually selling our plants, right? For the animal systems, we're really learning those different technical veterinary terms. We're practicing administering medical products to animals. And within all of these things, we're getting our hands to work, because that's one of the best ways, in my opinion, to teach, is to take that knowledge and actually do it, right? Mm-hmm. And then third, we're going to talk about the student leadership portion of this ag education model. And the most important part of that in agriculture is going to be the FFA. So the FFA is a student leadership organization that's based around agriculture education. And we have the Gogebic-Ontonagon FFA chapter that my students in all of the years I've been teaching have been able to compete in certain leadership competitions to develop those leadership skills, such as public speaking and job interview and things of that nature.
Okay. So for our listeners who might not be familiar with FFA, or even if they are familiar with FFA, is that organization, is that program continue to be what it was in the past, or has that changed with the times as well?
Right. I'm really glad you asked that. So a lot of people who've heard of the FFA have formerly recognized it as the Future Farmers of America Association. And although that is correct in what it used to be called, they've actually changed the name of the FFA to just FFA, because they wanted everybody who is in that organization to feel like they are a part of it. It's very diverse in the agriculture sector, in terms that all farmers are not the only people in agriculture. Mm-hmm. It's so all encompassing. And that name change was really a milestone for them to recognize so many people work in agriculture. And if you're part of this organization, you know that you don't have to be a farmer to do that. And it really is symbiotic of the agriculture field as well, mm-hmm. because we're going to talk about later how many careers there are in the agriculture sector.
Okay. So when people look at our region in particular, they make the assumption that, there aren't a lot of farms in this region, or there isn't a lot of agricultural activity happening across the Upper Peninsula. But that's not quite true, is it?
That's correct. Yeah, it's a common conception that if you're going to take an agriculture course or the food systems and natural resource program, that, well, I don't want to go into farming. So why should I take this course? So this is the case that I always make. First of all, is that just like what you said, people don't think of the Upper Peninsula or Michigan as this huge agriculture state, but that really couldn't be further from the truth. So I want to share with you actually a few statistics that I brought today.
Sure, please go ahead.
So first, in the entire United States, 10% of our jobs are an agriculture related job. And Michigan in particular is a huge state for agriculture. Okay. Michigan produces more than 300 commodities, and that actually makes us the second most diverse agricultural state, only behind California, which is our biggest agricultural state that produce so many of our produces because of their landscape. They're able to do that. So we're in really good company there when we're talking about agricultural diversity. So a couple things that you might not know. We are number one in all of these produce that I'm going to tell you. We are the number one producer in the United States. So black beans and cranberry beans, fresh flowers, blueberries, tart cherries, pickling cucumbers, and squash. And we are number 3 in apple production, number 8 in potato production, and number 6 in milk production. And we also have a really big economy for agritourism, right? So our pumpkin patches, our pick your own apples, our berry picking, those types of businesses that are still an agricultural business, right? So we really have this amazing diversity in our state for agriculture. And within the state, it's about 40% crops and 60% livestock. So I really like to make a case to people how much agriculture is such an integral part of Michigan's economy, and that there are jobs out there for students.
Okay.
The next thing I like to say is that, just like what we said before, not everybody's going to be a farmer, right? Mm-hmm. But everybody's got to eat.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. And it's really important to recognize that after that food, that produce, that commodity leaves the farm, there's so many more things that have to happen in the meantime before we actually get that food in the restaurant or at the grocery store, right? There's certain processing that needs to be involved. There's going to be transportation, and there's going to be a lot of supporting staff along the way to make sure we do that safely and efficiently. And this is when I talk about all of the other careers that are involved. So all the people who work for these companies, all the people who work in food service, at the grocery stores, everyone in between who is involved in getting that product off of the farm and onto our tables works in the agriculture sector. And there's so much more supporting staff. And I like to tell people, any career you can think of, there's going to be a specialist in agriculture. There are specialists in agricultural law. There's specialists in agriculture accounting. There's going to be specialists in animal nutrition. So many of these things that we don't always think of related to agriculture, but are really important in the agricultural sector.
Okay, so this course really acts in many ways as a springboard to some of these other fields that students might be interested in, but they may not have been aware of.
Absolutely. And that's what I consider is one of my biggest responsibilities for students and for the public, is to help people recognize how many jobs are out there in the agriculture sector.
This ties into our last question about agriculture education. So you mentioned, Lori, that agriculture is more of a prevalent factor in our lives than many of us realize. You know, we take it for granted in many ways that we're able to just go to the grocery store and buy our steak or our produce or get a gallon of milk. But there are a lot of reasons why agriculture education is important.
That's right. And as you can tell, I'm really passionate about this topic. And it's really important for people to know that this sector is going to grow. Okay. By 2050, we're expected in this world to have 9 billion people that we need to feed. And we only have finite resources, or natural resources that we need to protect, but also make more food on. Right. And there's a lot of things that go into those systems to make sure we're doing that to provide for the world and also not deplete those natural resources. I really like to emphasize that. Another thing that's important about ag education in this growing field is that our average age of a U.S. agriculture worker, or this is specifically actually to the farmer, is going to be 58 years old. So like many of our career fields, we're going to see a lot of them aging out, and we're going to have a new generation of people taking those jobs, and they're going to bring their own excitement and their own innovation to these jobs, which is a really exciting thing. And that's why this is so important. So a couple topics I like to cover. Okay. The United States has an extremely effective and an extremely safe food supply. We know that. And compared to the rest of the world, we're really lucky to have that. Right. But it's still not perfect. It's not perfect at all. So there's always room for improvement. And a couple of things I want to talk about here. So we have different movements within agriculture. Okay. We have the support local agriculture. And then we also have our really big agriculture systems, right? We have our 5 big meat packers. We have our companies that are our seed salesmen. And it seems like they kind of control everything, right? And a lot of times in the agriculture world, we see this kind of back and forth and who's doing things better and what needs to change. And it's really important for me to tell my students that in agriculture, we need to work together. Okay. We have such a diverse land over the entire United States. Everybody's doing something different, right? So I like to tell people that part of this innovation in the ag sector is getting these 2 very different worlds to work together. Another thing that's important is that when we look into agriculture careers is our nutritional issues, right? We have, health problems in the United States, and part of that falls into our nutritional issues as well in terms of what kind of food products are we making, right? And I don't know if you're familiar with the Farm Bill. right? So our Farm Bill is a recurring piece of legislation. We're actually covering it in class right now.
Okay.
That's supposed to be renewed every 5 years. So last year is supposed to be renewed. It's got an extension that got put on that expired on September 30th. And now we're past that. And we're looking probably past this election season before we actually get that legislation renewed. And that's going to determine all of our federal spending that goes to really important programs in our country. Our nutrition assistance like SNAP and WIC, all of our crop insurance, our disaster relief, the United States Forestry, all of our extension agencies within our state universities. So really huge pieces of legislation that are going to determine the future of agriculture in the country for the next 5 years. Really important things that in our class we're really looking into, and what do we need to do to prioritize food production, taking care of our people, but also natural resource preservation, right? And then one more thing I really want to talk about here is educating students so they can go and educate people about what we call the producer-consumer information gap. Okay. So many of the people we talk to, you ask them certain things about their food products. Okay. Because food doesn't just come from the grocery store, right? We know that. Not everybody, but
a lot.
It's important, right? And I think it's on this next generation of students to close that information gap, to really look into making sure the consumer is educated about their food they're buying. So I want to give you one example, okay? One of the big controversies in food production is genetically modified organisms.
Oh, yes.
And you see it marketed everywhere, whether it's non-GMO, non-GMO, non-GMO. And consumers really do have a right to know these things. That's really important. But one thing that people don't know is that sticker, that label, the non-GMO, can get put on products that actually don't even have a non-GMO counterpart. For example, there are only a handful, I believe only 12 FDA-approved genetically modified organisms in the United States. So, for example, if you go to the store and you see non-GMO grapes, that can be kind of a deceptive marketing term because there isn't even a genetically modified grape.
So it's a marketing ploy that they're using to sell those grapes.
Yeah. One more example. I really like the pink Himalayan salt.
Okay.
I think that maybe it's a little fancy too. I like the way it looks. But if you look at some of those packagings, they also say non-GMO. And fun fact, salt actually doesn't have any genes to modify. So like what you said, a marketing ploy. So I really see in the future, like that's going to be, this next generation is going to really try to bring that honesty and that conversation between producer and consumer to try to do away with some of those things. And that comes with educating the consumer and the producer being held accountable for some of those things. And like I said, there's so many of these topics in ag education that are super important. And I'm so excited for this next generation to get into these career fields because I can see a lot of change coming. Okay. And then kind of what I like to call the hidden gem of my class is when we're actually looking at food production, is it's actually teaching these kids some self-sufficiency. We don't really like to talk about it, but during the time of the Great Depression, we had something called the Dust Bowl, right? Which was catastrophic. And it made the Great Depression even that much greater in a sense, where we had food shortages, right? And different things, we never know when these things can happen. And I think it's so important to teach these kids that knowledge of growing food, being able to take that knowledge to their own families and friends. That way, if it ever came down to it, we would have people in the world who know how to grow food, right? And, our numbers of farms are going down and the farms are just getting bigger. But I think it's important that as, citizens, we still are able to take that knowledge of growing food, preserving food, maybe like our grandmas did. I know my grandma's a really big gardener and canners. Not as much in the younger generation. I think it's kind of a a hidden gem of my class to be able to bring some of that knowledge back.
Sure.
Because not every people growing up, their uncle or their grandpa, or they were a farmer. Now I ask my classes, who do you know that's a farmer? Not so many people, right?
Right.
So this, not by, any fault of their own, they're not really getting this knowledge anymore. So that's where I really see importance in my class as well.
I think that the hidden gem is a major hidden gem.
Right.
I do remember my grandparents raising, one set of my grandparents were dairy farmers. And so they also had a garden that they also raised vegetables and fruit. And right up until very close to the end of their lives, they still canned and preserved. And that food tasted so much better and had a crispness and a texture that was much better than what you could buy in a store.
Absolutely. And it's all about the freshness too, right?
Yeah.
I tell my kids is the reason those farm fresh eggs taste better than the store ones. There's nothing wrong with the store ones. We rely on them, but we get the freshness of going outside, getting the eggs out of the coop, right? Those are all very real things.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be a trend, though, as we take a look at people becoming more self-sufficient, more people are container gardening or have raised bed gardens in their yards. Even people who live in urban areas may be growing something on their patios or balconies. So there does seem to be an interest in that. And we even see people raising their own chickens now for eggs and for meat.
Absolutely. And one of the great things is that there's so much innovation in these things too. The different vertical gardens. We actually have vertical gardens in our classrooms called the Flex Farm.
Okay.
And that's indoor agriculture where you're growing food on a small scale, of course. That could be, for not a bunch of people, but for some people, right?
To supplement what you're buying anyway,
absolutely.
Right?
And there's so much innovation in these things now that make it really exciting for students to get involved in. Absolutely.
Right. Well, this was a lot of information packed into one episode, Lori. We're going to have you come back and share more about what you and your students are doing in your class. I'm sure they're off to a great year, and I'm excited to get in and visit to see what you and your students are up to. That's all we have for today's episode. Our next episode will be posted later this month, and will feature our instructional services department and programs and support that are available to schools, teachers, and families. If you enjoyed today's episode and have more questions, please feel free to contact Ashley Nevins, the Associate Superintendent of Career and Technical Education, at anevins, NEVINS, at GOISD.org, or by calling 906-575-3438, extension 200. Thanks for listening, and have a wonderful day.